Sometimes the dead are more alive than those who claim to be living. The mountain mist hung thick over Crow's Hollow that August morning, turning the small chapel into an island floating above the clouds. Dr. Elena Vasquez had driven 8 hours from Atlanta to pay her respects to Marcus Thorne, a man whose broken ribs and internal bleeding she'd treated just 3 weeks ago at the county hospital. Something about his quiet desperation had reminded her of her brother David, the same haunted eyes of someone carrying unbearable secrets. As the preacher droned on about eternal rest, Elena noticed the unnatural stillness of the gathered mourners. No tears, no shared memories, just uncomfortable glances and shuffling feet. That's when the chapel doors exploded open. "He's not dead," the mountain woman's voice cut through the humid air like a rusty blade. Agatha Crenshaw stood in the doorway, her grey hair wild, mud caked on her boots. "I seen him walking Devil's Ridge at sunrise, clear as I'm standing here." The funeral director moved to escort her out, but Elena stepped forward. As a forensic pathologist, she'd learned to trust the impossible hunches that others dismissed. Something was wrong here, wrong enough that a woman would risk the town's anger to speak her truth. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "The hook." Elena raised her hand, and the funeral director froze mid-step. "Let her speak," she said, her voice carrying the authority that came from 20 years of commanding autopsy rooms and courtrooms alike. The chapel fell silent except for the creak of old wooden pews as mourners shifted uncomfortably. Elena studied their faces, a collection of weathered mountain folk, a few men in suits who looked distinctly out of place, and a woman in the front row whose perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the relief flickering across her features when Agatha had burst in. "Mrs. Crenshaw, isn't it?" Elena had treated Agatha's grandson for a broken arm 6 months ago during one of her monthly volunteer shifts at the rural clinic. "Tell us exactly what you saw." Agatha's wild eyes fixed on Elena with startling clarity. Walking the ridge path like he'd done every morning since he come to town. Same black jacket, same limp in his left leg from whatever hurt him bad before he landed here. Her gnarled finger pointed toward the closed casket. "That ain't Marcus Thorne in that box." A murmur rippled through the chapel. The funeral director, a thin man whose nervous energy reminded Elena of a hummingbird, stepped forward again. "Now see here, Mrs. Crenshaw, this is highly inappropriate. The family has been through enough." "What family?" Agatha's cackle was sharp as broken glass. "Show me one person in this room who knew that man before 3 months ago. Show me one person who can tell you his middle name, where he was born, what made him smile." Elena's trained eye swept the congregation again. Agatha was right. These weren't the faces of grieving family and friends. They were the faces of people going through motions, playing parts in a performance none of them believed in. The woman in the front row, mid-30s, auburn hair pulled into a severe bun, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white, finally spoke. I was his girlfriend, Sarah Mitchell. He told me about his childhood in Kentucky, about losing his parents in a fire when he was 12. But even as she spoke the words, Sarah's voice carried no conviction. Elena had heard enough lies in witness testimony to recognize uncertainty masquerading as fact. "And yet," Elena said quietly, "when I treated Marcus at the hospital, he had no reaction to morphine, none at all. I had to use a completely different pain management protocol. Most people develop that kind of tolerance through long-term opioid use or a specific genetic variant. Did he ever mention either to you?" Sarah's perfect composure cracked just slightly. He didn't like to talk about medical things." Elena nodded, filing away another piece of the puzzle. She'd noticed Marcus's unusual reaction to medication, along with several other anomalies during his treatment. The surgical scars that didn't match his stated medical history. The way he'd flinched when she'd asked routine questions about emergency contacts. The fact that he'd paid his entire hospital bill in cash and disappeared the day after his discharge. "Sheriff Hawkins," Elena called to a man slouched in the back pew, his uniform wrinkled, and his expression suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else. "Has anyone actually identified the body?" Hawkins shifted uncomfortably. "Well now, Dr. Vasquez, seeing as how he died alone in his trailer and all, we went by the identification he carried. Didn't seem necessary to put folks through any additional distress." Elena felt the familiar surge of determination that had driven her through medical school, through her forensic training, through the endless nights spent reviewing case files and autopsy reports. The same drive that had consumed her after David's death, pushing her to question everything, to never accept the easy answers that let people sleep better at night. "I'd like to examine the body," she announced. The chapel erupted. Voices overlapped, protests from the funeral director, objections from Sheriff Hawkins about proper procedures, nervous muttering from the congregation. But through it all, Elena heard what mattered most: silence from Sarah Mitchell. No outraged defense of her supposed boyfriend's dignity, no tearful pleas to let him rest in peace, just silence. And those white knuckles gripping tighter. Elena had learned to read death like a language. Every wound told a story. Every mark revealed a truth that the living tried to hide. And right now, every instinct she'd honed through thousands of autopsies was screaming that Marcus Thorne's story didn't end with a heart attack in a lonely trailer. It ended with questions that could shatter this quiet mountain town's carefully maintained fiction. "Give me 10 minutes with the body," Elena said, her voice cutting through the chaos. 10 minutes to put Mrs. Crenshaw's concerns to rest, and we can proceed with the service." She looked directly at Sarah Mitchell, whose makeup was finally beginning to betray the sweat beneath. Unless, of course, someone has a reason to object to confirming we're burying the right man. The silence that followed was answer enough. Sheriff Hawkins stood slowly, his weathered face creased with the kind of exhaustion Elena recognized in herself, the bone-deep weariness that came from years of carrying other people's tragedies. But where her burden drove her to dig deeper, his seemed to have taught him the opposite lesson. "Dr. Vasquez," he said, his voice carrying the careful tone of a man walking through a minefield, "I appreciate your thoroughness. But we're not in the city here. We do things different in Crow's Hollow. Simpler." Elena studied him, noting the slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes didn't quite meet hers. In her world, the sterile, controlled environment of the medical examiner's office back in Baltimore, proper procedure wasn't negotiable. Chain of custody, thorough documentation, multiple verification points. She'd built her entire career on the foundation that truth could always be excavated if you knew where to look, and had the persistence to keep digging. "Simpler doesn't mean correct," she replied. "And in my experience, Sheriff, when people die alone and unidentified, that's exactly when we need to be most careful." She could feel the weight of the congregation's stares, the palpable tension that seemed to press against the chapel's walls like a living thing. This wasn't her town, weren't her people. She had no jurisdiction here, no official standing beyond her medical credentials and 20 years of experience, testifying in cases that mattered. But David's voice echoed in her memory. The conversation they'd had 3 weeks before his death, when he'd called her apartment at midnight, drunk and rambling about how doctors were supposed to be healers, not just bureaucrats processing cases, how somewhere along the way they'd all forgotten that every patient was someone's brother, someone's child. "I'm not asking for a full autopsy," Elena said, softening her tone slightly. "Just basic identification verification. Dental records, surgical scars, anything that could confirm identity. It's standard procedure in any suspicious death." "Suspicious?" Sarah Mitchell's voice cracked like a whip. "Marcus had a heart condition. He told me—" "What kind of heart condition?" Elena interrupted. "Specifically." "Because when I treated him for those injuries 3 weeks ago, his cardiac workup was completely normal. Blood pressure, EKG, stress indicators. Everything was within normal limits for a man his supposed age." The lie came so smoothly that Elena almost believed it herself. Marcus's cardiac function had been normal, but she hadn't run a complete workup. His injuries hadn't warranted it. But Sarah didn't know that, and the way her face paled suggested she didn't know much about Marcus's medical history at all. "Dr. Vasquez," the funeral director interjected, wringing his hands. "We really must consider the dignity of the deceased, the emotional well-being of those who cared about him. The dignity of the deceased is best served by ensuring we're burying the right person," Elena cut him off. She'd had this conversation countless times with families who wanted to avoid autopsies, who preferred the comfort of unanswered questions to the harsh clarity of forensic truth. Back home, she had allies in these moments. Detective Morrison, who'd worked with her on dozens of cases and trusted her instincts implicitly. Dr. Chen, her mentor, who'd taught her that medicine was as much about reading people as reading symptoms. Even her apartment building's doorman, Roberto, who'd become an unexpected confidant during late-night conversations when she couldn't sleep. Here, she was alone with her convictions and a growing certainty that nothing about Marcus Thorne added up. "Mrs. Crenshaw," Elena said, turning back to Agatha, "you said you've seen him walking the ridgelines. When? What time of day?" "Dawn, mostly. Sometimes just after sunset. Always alone, always following the old deer paths up toward Raven's Rock." Agatha's eyes held a sharpness that belied her wild appearance. "That man had routines, Doctor. Same path, same time, like he was checking on something, or watching for something." Elena filed that information away. In her experience, people with secrets developed patterns, rituals that gave them the illusion of control. She'd seen it in her own life. The way she'd started taking the same route to work every day after David's death, the way she'd reorganized her entire apartment to eliminate any reminders of their shared childhood. 10 minutes, she repeated, looking around the chapel one final time. "That's all I need to put this question to rest." But even as she said the words, Elena knew she was lying to herself as much as to them. 10 minutes wouldn't be enough. Nothing would be enough until she understood who was really in that coffin, and why an entire town seemed invested in burying their questions along with him. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, and Elena realized she was standing at the edge of something much larger than a simple case of mistaken identity, something that would either vindicate her instincts or destroy what little peace she'd managed to build since leaving Baltimore. The funeral director made the decision for them all. "Absolutely not." His voice carried a finality that cut through the chapel's suffocating tension. "I will not allow the desecration of the deceased based on the ravings of—" He gestured dismissively toward Agatha, then seemed to catch himself. "Based on unsubstantiated claims." Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a familiar tightening she'd learned to recognize as the moment when a case transformed from professional curiosity to personal mission. It was the same feeling she'd had 3 years ago when she'd first suspected the nursing home deaths weren't accidental. The same relentless pull that had driven her to spend 18 months building an airtight case against a killer who'd hidden behind a caregiver's smile. "Then I'll file for a court order," she said quietly. The chapel erupted again, but this time the voices carried a different quality, panic instead of mere discomfort. Sheriff Hawkins was on his feet, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio. Sarah Mitchell had gone completely white, her carefully applied makeup now stark against skin that looked bloodless. "Dr. Vasquez," Hawkins said, his conciliatory tone not quite masking the warning beneath. "That seems excessive. Maybe you should consider whether this is really your concern." Elena turned to face him fully, and in that moment, every lesson she'd learned about reading people crystallized into perfect clarity. The sheriff wasn't just reluctant, he was afraid. The funeral director wasn't protecting the dignity of the dead, he was protecting something else entirely. And Sarah Mitchell wasn't grieving a lost lover, she was terrified of discovery. "You're right," Elena said slowly. "This isn't my concern. I'm just a visiting doctor who happened to treat an injured man 3 weeks ago. I have no authority here, no jurisdiction, no official standing whatsoever." Relief flickered across several faces. "But I do have a medical license and 20 years of forensic experience, and I have contacts at the state medical examiner's office who would be very interested in a case involving questionable identity verification and possible improper burial procedures." The relief died instantly. Elena pulled out her phone, noting how the simple gesture made several people flinch. Dr. Martinez owes me a favor from the Kellerman case last year. One phone call, and she'll have a forensic team here by tomorrow morning with proper court orders and all the authority they need. Wait! Sarah Mitchell's voice was barely above a whisper. She stood slowly, her legs visibly shaking. Wait, please. The chapel fell completely silent. Even Agatha seemed to hold her breath. Elena kept her finger poised over her phone's screen, but she waited. Experience had taught her that the moment before someone broke was often the most crucial. Push too hard, and they'd retreat behind lawyers and denials. Show patience, and they might just reveal everything. If you examined him, Sarah said, each word seeming to cost her tremendous effort, what would happen to the information you found? That would depend on what I discovered, Elena replied honestly. If the body is Marcus Thorne and died of natural causes, then nothing happens. The service continues, he gets buried, and everyone goes home. And if it's not, Elena met her eyes directly, then we have a much bigger problem that won't go away just because we bury it. Sarah looked around the chapel wildly, her gaze settling briefly on Sheriff Hawkins, then on a man in an expensive suit sitting near the back who Elena hadn't noticed before. Both men gave almost imperceptible shakes of their heads. But Elena saw something else in that moment, the way several other mourners were watching Sarah with the intensity of people whose own secrets hung in the balance. The careful positioning of the men in suits, too spread out to be coincidental. The nervous energy that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with barely controlled panic. This wasn't just about one man's identity. This was about something systematic, organized, and much more dangerous than a simple case of mistaken identity. Elena made her choice. She hit the speed dial for Dr. Martinez's direct line. Elena Martinez picked up on the second ring. I thought you were taking time off. I am. But I've stumbled into something that needs official attention. I'm in Crow's Hollow, about 3 hours northeast of you, and I need a forensic team for a questionable death investigation. The chapel had gone so quiet Elena could hear her own heartbeat. Every eye was fixed on her phone. How questionable? Martinez asked. Elena looked directly at Sarah Mitchell, then at Sheriff Hawkins, then at the expensive suit in the back row. The kind that's about to become a federal matter, if I'm right about what's really going on here. Sarah Mitchell collapsed back into her pew as if her strings had been cut, and Elena realized that her 10-minute examination had just become a full-scale investigation that would either expose a small-town conspiracy or destroy her credibility forever. But as David had always said, some chances were worth taking, even when, especially when, everyone else wanted you to walk away. The moment Dr. Martinez's voice faded from the phone, Elena felt the full weight of what she'd just set in motion crash down on her like a physical blow. The chapel's silence pressed against her eardrums, and she could feel 30 pairs of eyes boring into her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. What have I done? She'd called for backup on instinct, the same way she'd reach for a scalpel when faced with an autopsy. But this wasn't her sterile, controlled environment in Baltimore. This was a place where she had no allies, no support system, no understanding of the local dynamics that could turn deadly if she'd miscalculated. Elena's hands began to tremble, barely perceptible, but she noticed. She always noticed her body's responses to stress, had trained herself to read her own physiological reactions the same way she read a corpse's wounds. Elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, the metallic taste of adrenaline on her tongue. Fight or flight responses that her rational mind tried to suppress, even as her subconscious screamed warnings. She thought of her apartment back home, with its precisely organized case files and carefully curated silence. Safe, predictable, empty enough that she couldn't hurt anyone else with her relentless need to dig up truths that others preferred buried. You could still call Martinez back, a voice whispered in her head. Tell her it was a false alarm. Apologize to these people and drive away. But then she looked at Sarah Mitchell, collapsed in her pew with tears streaming down her face. and saw herself 3 years ago when the nursing home administrators had tried to convince her that those deaths were just an unfortunate coincidence. The same desperate fear of being silenced, of watching truth disappear under layers of bureaucratic convenience. Except this time, Elena was the one with the power to expose or conceal. Sheriff Hawkins moved closer, his hand still resting near his radio. "Dr. Vasquez, I think you might be misunderstanding the situation here. Small towns like ours, we handle things quietly, privately. No need to involve outsiders who don't understand our ways." The implied threat hung in the air like smoke. Elena had heard similar warnings before, from hospital administrators who didn't want publicity, from insurance companies that preferred settled cases to thorough investigations. But here, isolated on a mountain with no cell towers for miles, except the one they'd somehow reached Martinez through, the menace felt more immediate. David would have walked away, she realized with sudden, painful clarity. Her brother had always been the cautious one, weighing risks against benefits with mathematical precision. He'd spent his entire medical career playing by the rules, accepting the safe diagnoses, never pushing too hard against the comfortable assumptions that kept everyone sleeping soundly. And it had killed him. The thought hit her like a physical blow. David's death hadn't been about medical incompetence or rare genetic conditions that mimicked heart disease. It had been about a system that rewarded conformity over curiosity, that punished doctors who asked uncomfortable questions about unusual symptoms. Elena's trembling stopped. She looked around the chapel again, but this time she saw it through different eyes. Not as a hostile environment where she was outnumbered and vulnerable, but as a crime scene that was about to be contaminated if she didn't act decisively. The man in the expensive suit was typing on his phone with the urgent movements of someone calling in reinforcements. 2 other men near the back had positioned themselves between her and the exit, casual enough to seem accidental, deliberate enough that Elena's trained eye caught the tactical positioning. They're not just hiding Marcus's identity, she realized. They're protecting an entire operation. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it crystallized her resolve with startling clarity. Spent 3 years drowning in guilt over David's death, convinced that she should have pushed harder, questioned more aggressively, trusted her instincts instead of deferring to his doctor's expertise. Here was her chance to not make the same mistake twice. "Sheriff," Elena said, her voice carrying a steadiness that surprised her, "Dr. Martinez is already dispatching a team. They'll be here by evening with proper warrants and federal oversight. You can either cooperate with a controlled investigation, or you can explain to the FBI why a small-town funeral became a federal case." The bluff was enormous. Martinez would need hours just to assemble a team, assuming she could even get the necessary approvals for what amounted to Elena's professional hunch. But the faces around her suggested that panic was overriding rational thought. Sarah Mitchell looked up from her pew, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "You don't understand what you're doing. The people involved, they don't just disappear problems. They disappear people." Elena felt ice settle in her stomach, but she kept her expression neutral. Then maybe it's time someone shed some light on who these people are. Too late to turn back now, she thought, even as every survival instinct screamed that she'd just painted a target on her back. The weight of her words hung in the chapel's stifling air like a death sentence. Elena watched the ripple effect of fear spread across the congregation's faces and realized with crystalline clarity that she'd just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The trembling in her hands had stopped completely, replaced by the steady calm that always came when she committed fully to a path, the same feeling she'd had when she'd testified, against the nursing home killer, knowing it would end her comfortable position, but unable to live with the alternative. Sheriff Hawkins's radio crackled to life, and he stepped away to answer it, his voice too low for Elena to make out the words. But she could read his body language, the rigid posture of a man receiving orders he didn't like. When he turned back, his expression had shifted from wary politeness to something much colder. "Dr. Vasquez," he said, "I just got word that there's been a landslide on Route 9. Roads completely blocked. Might take days to clear." The lie was so transparent it was almost insulting. Elena had driven Route 9 less than 2 hours ago. Clear skies, stable conditions, no signs of geological instability. But the message was unmistakable. You're not leaving until we decide to let you. Fortunately, Elena replied, pulling out her phone again. Dr. Martinez's team has helicopters. Another bluff, but a calculated one. The state medical examiner's office did have helicopter access for remote cases, though getting authorization would require paperwork Elena couldn't file and justifications she couldn't provide. Yet, Agatha Crenshaw, who had been silent through the escalating confrontation, suddenly laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the chapel's wooden walls. You city folk think you understand what you're dealing with, but this goes deeper than one dead man with the wrong name. Elena turned to study the mountain woman more carefully. Agatha's wild appearance and dramatic entrance had made it easy to dismiss her as a local eccentric, but her eyes held a sharpness that spoke of intelligence deliberately concealed. In Elena's experience, people who let others underestimate them usually had good reasons for the deception. Then help me understand, Elena said quietly. Agatha glanced around the chapel, taking in the nervous faces, the men positioned near exits, the palpable sense of barely controlled panic. 15 years ago, there was an accident. Chemical plant up in Millbrook, about 40 miles north. Big explosion, toxic cloud, whole mess covered up real quick by people with enough money to make problems disappear. Elena felt puzzle pieces clicking into place in her mind. People were exposed. People were killed. Others got sick, real sick. The kind of sick that makes you unemployable, uninsurable, unable to live anywhere that might trace back to that plant. Agatha's voice carried the weight of old grief. Some folks just disappeared. Started over somewhere else with new names and medical records that didn't mention chemical exposure. The chapel had gone completely silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different. No longer the shocked hush of exposure, but the heavy quiet of old secrets finally being dragged into daylight. Elena's mind raced through the implications. A chemical disaster, covered up by corporate money. Victims forced to assume new identities to escape medical discrimination and legal complications, and now someone using Marcus Thorne's stolen identity was dead, threatening to expose an entire network of survivors who'd built new lives on carefully constructed lies. The real Marcus Thorne, Elena said, understanding flooding through her. He was one of the victims. Car accident, they said. Single vehicle collision on a mountain road. Body burned beyond recognition. Agatha's laugh was bitter. Convenient considering his identity documents survived just fine. Elena looked at Sarah Mitchell, who was staring at her hands with the intensity of someone trying to disappear through willpower alone. You're not grieving a lover. You're terrified of exposure. Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wild with desperation. Do you have any idea what it's like to live for 15 years knowing that one database search could destroy everything you've built? One medical exam that shows the wrong kind of scarring, one background check that digs too deep? The pain in her voice was genuine, and Elena felt an unexpected stab of empathy. She thought of her own carefully constructed isolation, the way she'd rebuilt her life after David's death by eliminating anything that could hurt her again. But these people hadn't chosen their exile. It had been forced on them by circumstances beyond their control. Still, empathy didn't change the facts. Someone was dead, and the truth wouldn't stay buried just because it was inconvenient. I'm sorry, Elena said, and meant it. But whoever's in that coffin deserves to have his real name on his gravestone, and his family deserves to know what happened to him. The man in the expensive suit stood up from his back pew, and Elena finally got a clear look at his face. Mid-50s, silver hair, the kind of quietly expensive clothes that suggested serious money. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Dr. Vasquez, I think it's time we had a more private conversation about your concerns. Elena looked around the chapel one final time, at the frightened faces, the tactical positioning, the heavy weight of secrets that had been festering for 15 years. She thought of David, who had always chosen the safe path, the quiet compliance that had ultimately failed to protect him. No, she said simply. I think it's time for a very public conversation about what really happened in Millbrook. The man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the chapel's atmosphere. A sense of invisible lines being drawn, of forces gathering that Elena couldn't yet see, but could definitely feel. She'd committed now, irrevocably. Whatever came next, there would be no going back to her quiet apartment, her controlled environment, her carefully managed solitude. The hunt for truth had begun, and Elena finally felt alive again. The man in the expensive suit didn't introduce himself, but Elena could read power in the way he moved, controlled, deliberate, accustomed to having his presence reshape a room's dynamics. When he stepped into the center aisle, the other men shifted positions with practiced subtlety, and Elena realized she was looking at something far more organized than a small-town cover-up. "Dr. Vasquez," he said, his tone carrying the false warmth of corporate negotiation. "I'm Robert Castellanos. I represent certain interests that have been monitoring this situation. Perhaps we could step outside for a moment." Elena's forensic training had taught her to read crime scenes, but 3 years of testifying in high-stakes cases had taught her to read people. Castellanos wasn't making a request. He was testing whether she understood the new rules of engagement. The way his associates had positioned themselves suggested that declining his invitation might not be an option. "I'm comfortable here," Elena replied, noting how Agatha Crenshaw had edged closer to her, the mountain woman's weathered hands clenched into fists. An unexpected ally, perhaps, or someone with her own agenda. "Whatever you need to say, these people have a right to hear it." Castellanos' smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered behind his eyes. "I'm afraid the conversation I have in mind involves matters of national security. Chemical plant accidents, even those from 15 years ago, sometimes have ongoing implications." The phrase hit Elena like a physical blow. National security. The kind of classification that could make evidence disappear. Witnesses relocate involuntarily, and inconvenient forensic pathologists find themselves facing federal charges for obstruction of justice. She'd heard whispers of such cases during her residency. Mysterious deaths that federal agencies took over, leaving local investigators with sealed files and strict orders to forget what they'd seen. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Martinez, having trouble getting authorization for Crow's Hollow deployment. Some kind of federal flag on the location. What exactly did you stumble into? Elena's stomach dropped. She'd assumed she was dealing with corporate malfeasance and local corruption, but federal flags suggested something exponentially more dangerous. The kind of case that could end careers, or worse. But then she caught sight of Sarah Mitchell, still collapsed in her pew but watching Elena with desperate hope, and realized that her fear was nothing compared to what these people had been living with for 15 years. They'd been abandoned by their government, betrayed by the corporations they'd worked for, and forced to choose between slow death from chemical exposure and complete erasure of their identities. "Dr. Vasquez." The voice came from behind her, and Elena turned to see a young woman entering through a side door of the chapel. 30s, professional clothes but practical shoes, the kind of purposeful movement that suggested law enforcement training. "Agent Lisa Chen, FBI. I need you to come with me." Elena felt the walls closing in. Federal agents appearing within hours of her phone call, national security classifications, roads mysteriously blocked, all the classic signs of a situation spiraling beyond her control. But something in Agent Chen's expression gave her pause. The FBI agent kept glancing nervously at Castellanos, and her hand rested near her weapon, with the tension of someone who wasn't entirely sure which direction the threat might come from. "Agent Chen," Castellanos said smoothly. "Mr. Castellanos." Chen's voice was carefully neutral, but Elena caught the subtle emphasis that suggested these two knew each other, and not in a friendly capacity. "Dr. Vasquez is under federal protection as a material witness. Any interference with her investigation will be considered obstruction of justice." The temperature in the chapel seemed to drop 10 degrees. Elena realized she was watching a jurisdictional standoff between federal agencies, with herself as the prize they were fighting over. But Agent Chen had used the Fraser investigation, suggesting that Elena's amateur detective work had somehow gained official status. Agatha Crenshaw stepped forward, her wild hair and mountain clothes a stark contrast to the suited federal agents. "Y'all can play your government games all you want, but this is still my mountain and these are still my people. Dr. Vasquez stays until she gets the answers she came for." Elena stared at the mountain woman in amazement. Agatha was openly defying federal agents with the confidence of someone who had leverage Elena couldn't see. What kind of secrets did a seemingly powerless mountain woman hold that could make FBI agents hesitate? "The Millbrook files," Agent Chen said quietly, and Elena saw Castellanos' expression shift for the first time. "We know you've been trying to bury them for 15 years. But there are copies, aren't there, Agatha?" Agatha smiled, and for the first time since Elena had met her, the mountain woman looked genuinely dangerous. "Lots of copies, in lots of places, with lots of people who know exactly what to do if something happens to me or anyone else in this chapel." Elena felt the ground shift beneath her feet as she realized that the grieving mountain community she'd stumbled into was actually a sophisticated network of survivors who'd spent 15 years preparing for exactly this moment. And somehow, her forensic examination of one misidentified corpse had become the catalyst for a confrontation that had been building for over a decade. The standoff stretched across heartbeats that felt like hours. Elena found herself at the center of a triangle formed by Agent Chen, Castellanos, and Agatha, each representing forces she was only beginning to understand. The chapel's air had grown thick with tension and the weight of 15 years' worth of buried secrets, clawing their way toward daylight. "Dr. Vasquez," Agent Chen said carefully, never taking her eyes off Castellanos, "I need you to understand that your safety depends on making the right choice here. The Bureau has been investigating the Millbrook incident for years, but we've never had a catalyst like this, someone with your credentials who stumbled onto the truth independently." Elena felt her analytical mind racing through possibilities, each more dangerous than the last. She was being recruited by the FBI, threatened by corporate interests, and protected by mountain people who apparently possessed leverage that could paralyze federal agents. The forensic pathologist in her wanted evidence, documentation, proof. But the survivor in her, the part that had learned to read threats during 3 years of high-stakes testimony, was screaming warnings about every person in the room. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Elena's voice remained steady despite the chaos in her mind. She'd perfected that tone during depositions where million-dollar settlements hung on her ability to present findings without betraying uncertainty. "Help us build a case," Chen replied. "Your examination of the body provides the first solid evidence we've had of identity theft connected to Millbrook. But we need more than one corpse. We need the network, the documentation, the proof of systematic cover-up." Castellanos laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Agent Chen, you're asking Dr. Vasquez to sign her own death warrant. The interests involved in keeping Millbrook buried have resources that make federal protection look like playground supervision." Sarah Mitchell's sob cut through the verbal sparring, raw and desperate. Elena turned to see the younger woman doubled over in her pew, shoulders shaking with the kind of grief that comes from watching safety crumble in real time. Around the chapel, other faces reflected the same devastation. People who'd spent 15 years building new lives now watching their carefully constructed refuge collapse. "They found us before," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. 3 years ago, in Tennessee, Maria Santos, she was one of us, had been living as Jennifer Walsh for 12 years. Happy, married, 2 kids. Then one day her husband came home and found the house empty. No signs of struggle, no note, nothing, just gone. The chapel fell silent except for Sarah's ragged breathing. Elena felt ice forming in her stomach as she grasped the implications. These people weren't just hiding from medical discrimination or legal complications. They were hiding from something that made people disappear without a trace. Agatha Crenshaw moved closer to Elena, and for the first time, the mountain woman's voice carried no trace of her earlier theatrical dramatics. "Dr. Vasquez, you seem like good people. But you need to understand what you're walking into. The Millbrook chemical plant wasn't just any facility. It was producing compounds for military applications, under contracts so classified that when the accident happened, half the workers didn't even know what they'd been exposed to. Elena's medical training kicked in, assembling the pieces with clinical precision. Military chemicals meant weapons development, possibly biological or chemical agents that could cause long-term damage far beyond typical industrial accidents. Survivors with evidence of exposure would represent ongoing security risks, potential sources of embarrassing congressional hearings or international incidents. The people who've been hunting us, Agatha continued, they're not just corporate lawyers trying to avoid lawsuits. They're national security specialists whose job is to make sure certain secrets never see daylight. Agent Chen's hand moved imperceptibly closer to her weapon, which is exactly why Dr. Vasquez needs FBI protection. We can offer witness protection, new identity, complete relocation. Like you offered Maria Santos? Sarah's voice was bitter, accusatory. Your people promised to help her 3 months before she disappeared. Funny coincidence. Elena watched Chen's face carefully, looking for tells, for the micro-expressions that revealed deception. What she saw instead was something worse, the controlled panic of someone who was beginning to suspect that her own agency might be compromised. The realization hit Elena like a physical blow. She wasn't just caught between competing federal agencies, she was trapped in a situation where some elements within the government were actively hunting Millbrook survivors, while others were supposedly trying to protect them. And there was no way to tell which was which until it was too late. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Martinez Elena. I'm getting pushback from levels above my clearance. Whatever you've found, it's bigger than chemical accidents. Consider backing away while you still can. Elena stared at the message, feeling the weight of her brother's death pressing against her chest. David had backed away, had accepted the safe answers, had trusted the system to protect him. She'd spent 3 years drowning in guilt over her failure to push harder for the truth. She looked around the chapel one final time, at the terrified faces, the federal agents playing games with people's lives, the mountain woman who'd somehow become the keeper of secrets that could topple governments. Everything in her training, her experience, her survival instincts told her to walk away. Instead, she deleted Martinez's text and turned to face Agent Chen with the same resolve that had carried her through testifying against killers. Tell me about the Millbrook files. Agent Chen's expression shifted from cautious hope to barely controlled alarm. She glanced at Castellanos, whose corporate smile had vanished entirely, then back at Elena, with the look of someone watching a civilian step onto a battlefield they couldn't possibly comprehend. Dr. Vasquez, that's not a conversation for here. Not with people whose lives depend on the answer. Elena cut her off, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline that had carried her through her most dangerous testimony. I'm done with careful conversations and federal protection and dancing around the truth. These people have been running for 15 years from something they didn't cause. I want to know what. Castellanos stepped forward, his corporate veneer cracking to reveal something far more dangerous underneath. Dr. Vasquez, you're making a mistake that will cost more than just your career. The Millbrook files are classified at levels that would make your previous federal testimony look like a high school debate. Elena felt the walls of the chapel pressing in around her, but instead of panic, she experienced the strange clarity that had always come in moments of maximum danger. This was her brother's death all over again. Authorities insisting she accept easy answers, trust the system, let other people handle the complicated truth. But this time she could see the human cost of that compliance written across the terrified faces surrounding her. Agent Chen, Elena said, her voice carrying the authority she'd learned during years of courtroom testimony. Either arrest me or start talking. Because I'm not leaving this chapel until I understand what happened to these people. Chen looked around the chapel at the assembled survivors, her FBI training clearly at war with whatever orders she'd received. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone crossing a line she couldn't uncross. Millbrook wasn't just a chemical plant. It was a joint military corporate research facility developing next-generation chemical agents under contract with the Department of Defense. When the containment system failed, the exposure wasn't just industrial chemicals, it was experimental compounds designed for battlefield deployment. Elena felt her medical training immediately grasping the implications. Experimental military chemicals meant unpredictable long-term effects, unknown treatment protocols, and symptoms that would immediately flag survivors in any medical database. No wonder these people had been forced to disappear. The official story, Chen continued, ignoring Castellanos' warning gestures, was equipment failure during routine chemical processing. But the real cause was sabotage. Someone with intimate knowledge of the facility's security systems deliberately triggered the release. Sarah Mitchell's gasp was audible across the chapel. Sabotage? We were told it was an accident, that safety protocols had failed. The safety protocols worked perfectly, Chen said grimly. They contained about 60% of what should have been released. Without them, the contamination zone would have covered 3 counties instead of just the plant and immediate surrounding area. Elena's mind raced through the medical implications. How many people were exposed? 237 workers and emergency responders. Within 6 months, 63 were dead from what the official reports listed as various unrelated illnesses. The rest were quietly relocated with new identities and ongoing medical monitoring. Agatha Crenshaw's bitter laugh filled the chapel. Medical monitoring that gradually turned into hunting. Funny how government doctors can become government cleanup crews when the political situation changes. Elena turned to study the mountain woman with new understanding. You weren't just a survivor. You were part of the medical team. Dr. Agatha Crenshaw, formerly of the CDC's Chemical Emergency Response Division, Agatha confirmed, her theatrical mountain persona dropping away entirely. Until I discovered that half my colleagues were more interested in eliminating evidence than treating patients. The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd been assuming Agatha was a local eccentric who'd stumbled onto federal secrets. Instead, she was a trained epidemiologist who'd gone underground to protect the people her own agency had abandoned. The files Agent Chen mentioned, Elena said, pieces falling into place with terrifying precision. You took them when you disappeared. Copied them. Medical records, exposure data, government correspondence, corporate communications, everything that proves the ongoing cover-up and the systematic elimination of witnesses. Agatha's voice carried 15 years of carefully controlled rage. And before you ask, yes, there are multiple copies in multiple locations with multiple people who know exactly what to do if something happens to me. Castellanos' composure finally cracked completely. Dr. Crenshaw, you're discussing classified materials with unauthorized personnel. That's a federal crime punishable by... By what? Agatha stepped toward him, and Elena was startled to see genuine menace in the older woman's posture. Life imprisonment? Death? You people have been hunting us for 15 years. What exactly do you think? You can threaten me with that's worse than what we've already survived. Elena looked around the chapel and finally understood what she was seeing. This wasn't a mountain community, it was a fortress. These people had chosen Crow's Hollow not for its isolation, but for its defensibility. They'd spent 15 years preparing for this confrontation, and her examination of one misidentified corpse had finally triggered the battle they'd been expecting. Her phone buzzed with another message from Martinez, but Elena didn't look at it. She'd already made her choice. I want to see everything. The dark moment. The words hung in the air for 3 heartbeats before everything went sideways. Agent Chen's radio crackled to life with urgent chatter, and Elena caught fragments that made her blood freeze. Roadblocks established, all exits sealed, authorization to proceed with containment protocols. Containment protocols? Elena's medical training immediately translated the euphemism. In federal emergency response, containment didn't mean isolation. It meant elimination of the contamination source. Chen's face had gone ashen. She pressed her earpiece, listening to something that made her weapon hand tremble. When she looked up, her FBI authority had evaporated into raw terror. They're not my people, she whispered. The units surrounding the town. They're not bureau. Through the chapel's windows, Elena could see black vehicles moving along the ridge lines. Too many and too coordinated to be coincidental. The mechanical precision of their positioning reminded her of nature documentaries where predators systematically eliminated escape routes before closing in for the kill. Castellanos was speaking rapidly into his phone, but his corporate composure had completely shattered. Elena caught fragments. Wasn't supposed to happen this fast. Civilian casualties will compromise, abort and reassess. But whoever was on the other end apparently disagreed, because Castellanos went silent, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally a resignation that looked disturbingly like grief. Sarah Mitchell was sobbing openly now, clutching an older man Elena assumed was her husband. Around the chapel, the Millbrook survivors were displaying the practiced efficiency of people who'd rehearsed for exactly this scenario. Children were being quietly moved to interior rooms, adults checking weapons Elena hadn't noticed before, escape routes being activated with the smooth coordination of a military unit. 15 years, Agatha said, her voice hollow with exhaustion. We had 15 good years. Elena felt reality fracturing around her. 6 hours ago, she'd been a respected forensic pathologist attending a stranger's funeral. Now she was trapped in a mountain fortress surrounded by federal agents who apparently had orders to ensure no witnesses survived the night. Her phone buzzed one final time. Martinez Elena, satellite thermal shows at least 40 hostiles surrounding your position. Whatever protection you thought you had is gone. This is black site-level authorization. Get out now. Elena stared at the message, understanding with perfect clarity that she'd just received her death sentence. Black site authorization meant the situation had been classified beyond congressional oversight, beyond judicial review, beyond any accountability that might interfere with national security objectives. She thought of her brother David, dying alone in a sterile hospital room while she'd trusted federal authorities to handle the complications. She thought of Maria Santos, vanishing without a trace when she'd tried to cooperate with FBI protection. She thought of the 63 Millbrook workers who died from unrelated illnesses after believing government promises of medical care. The pattern was brutally clear. Anyone who posed a threat to the Millbrook secret died, but only after their trust had been earned and their guard had been lowered. Dr. Vasquez. Agent Chen's voice was barely a whisper. I need you to know. I thought I was protecting you. The Bureau told me this was witness protection, that we were building a case. I had no idea they were using me as bait. Elena looked at the FBI agent with something approaching pity. Chen was just another tool in a machine designed to eliminate problems quietly and efficiently. The real architects of whatever was happening outside would never set foot in Crow's Hollow, never see the faces of the people they'd condemned, never have to reconcile their orders with the human cost. Through the chapel windows, she could see movement in the tree line. Tactical teams with night vision equipment taking positions for what military manuals would call a precision strike with acceptable collateral damage. Agatha Crenshaw moved to the chapel's altar, her hands working quickly to remove something from beneath the cross. When she turned around, she was holding a laptop and several hard drives with the reverent care of someone handling holy relics. The Millbrook files, she said simply. Everything. 15 years of evidence that could bring down 3 federal agencies and 2 Fortune 500 companies. Elena stared at the small collection of electronics, understanding that she was looking at the reason 40 people with military-grade equipment were currently surrounding a mountain chapel. Somewhere in those drives was proof of criminal conspiracy, human experimentation, systematic murder, secrets worth any price to protect. They'll never let us leave here alive, Sarah whispered, echoing what everyone in the chapel already knew. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of every choice that had brought her to this moment. She'd come seeking answers about a stranger's death, and found herself at the center of a conspiracy that stretched back 15 years and reached into the highest levels of government. Outside, she could hear engines approaching. The siege of Crow's Hollow was about to begin.